And we're live. No drama today. InfoSec drama, reset the clock to zero. Hello, everyone. My name is Frank, for friend of Francesco Cipollone, for everybody else. Common jokes that we have. And we have another episode of this series. This has been particularly popular because we're going to talk about the annoyance of a lot of the vulnerability knowledge and information system and the common challenge that we have. And sometimes we feel, myself, Chris, and few others, to talk in a vacuum. So we said, let's get together in front of people and let's talk about all of this challenge. But before we dive deeper, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show. Chris, for the very few folks that don't know, Chris Hughes is the CEO of Acquia, is a father of an army of kids, is raising a new generation of cyber professional, is a fitness and very passionate about vulnerability management, author of 2 bestseller books on the vulnerability management and software security, and overall a fantastic person to talk to about these things. Chris, did I forget anything else?
I think you covered it. I think you got it.
Thank you very much. Welcome on the show. And let's crack maybe the first hard eggs. That is, how do you see regulation between Europe and US? How do you see the difference between the two landscape? What is driving actually security nowadays, aside from the whole buzz of AIs? I want to just go back, and we had the executive order, we had executive order redacted and written it back. We had the whole drama about DHS and CISA being withdrawn. There is a whole reshape of the security posture of the US government and what security should be. And then we had in Europe NIS2 being rolled out, the software security kind of executive order that being rolled out as part of NIS2 and DORA. So we had a whole regulation about software, but we seem to be obsessed right now about AI. So where are we from a software and vulnerability management from your perspective?
Yeah, if you would have asked me, say 6 months ago, or if the election in the United States went a different direction, I think, we would see more similarities in terms of the two. Obviously, there's still drastic differences. The U.S. overwhelmingly, especially now with the administrative change, it seems to be so far, is kind of heading down more of a path of voluntary guidance, best practices, recommendations, things of that nature, where the EU is kind of set out to, as some called it, I think some of even within government, I'm not sure, but to be a regulatory superpower. As you said, there's NIS2, there's DORA, there's the Cyber Resilience Act, there's the EU AI Act, and I'm having a hard time keeping up with them, honestly, especially not being based there myself. But they have global implications, right, for organizations doing business around the world. And those have some real teeth in things like in terms of like software liability or product liability, ramifications for companies around security and privacy and data residency, all those kind of things, vulnerability remediation, disclosure, transparency, et cetera. So we have a pretty drastic difference between the two. And I think we're honestly going to see some interesting things play out in terms of security and privacy and regulation and things of that nature, but contrasted against maybe perhaps innovation, speed to market, economic prosperity, even national security with the intersection of technology and kind of modern digital conflict, for example. So the difference between the two is really interesting. And I think it's going to be, to be seen in terms of if any approach is better than the other. I ultimately think, we need to find that middle ground because, we often hear like the phrase, compliance isn't security. I've used it throughout my career like everyone else, but I've kind of come around to think that it is security. It's just not the elimination of risk, and nothing is the elimination of risk, to be honest with you. We all know that, right? Other than not doing business or not having a product or not having software. But compliance is the floor. It's not the ceiling. It's, it's the baseline, right? It's not, we don't want to stop there in many cases. And I think without that floor, we'd kind of be in free fall in terms of the state of security in the industry. Because anyone who's worked in larger environments or organizations, if you try to go to development teams, engineering teams, leadership, and get them to do some kind of security, task or objective without kind of a requirement, like a compliance requirement to point to, it can be problematic. It can be challenging. They have other things they're working on. They're trying to get these features out. They're, trying to do other activities for customers. So compliance can be a good forcing function in that regard. But then again, you can go too far, right? It could impede innovation or slow down, developer velocity and speed to market. It can be cumbersome and costly. We've seen, for example, in the U.S., the Office of the National Cyber Director released an RFI for regulatory harmonization because we have this acronym soup of SOC 2, HIPAA, HITRUST, FedRAMP, NIST 2, DORA. You go on, and it's like a lot to try to keep track of that. And we live and breathe this. This is what we do for a living. Imagine development teams or engineers who are just trying to build a product, and I have no clue what the heck those acronyms mean, or what I need to do or not, or what these things are. So it's a long answer, but there's a big difference, I think, in the two approaches between the EU and the US right now. And I think there's going to be some pros and cons of each approach, and neither one is perfect.
No, it's interesting because I was also discussing this with a couple of other CISO friends, and they put a different kind of spin on it that right now the US seems to be a bit lax. So enforcing any security governance, it's harder because there aren't real teeth. What Europe is gearing up to having real teeth around cybersecurity, Cyber Resiliency Act needs to, even though, as we discussed, maybe in behind closed door, those have names as cybersecurity regulation, but need to be adopted by every state in the EU before having teeth. So we're probably looking at another couple of years before NIST 2 or DORA has actual real impact in the regulation, but people are actually gearing up. On one end, I do agree with you. We need better velocity between security and development. But as an industry, it's very hard to regulate ourselves. And in general, organizations are risk prone rather than risk averse. So they're likely going to go down the path of like, I'm going to go to market regardless if this is dangerous or not. And unless there is enough regulation to say you're going to actually face consequence, it's really difficult to portray the data breach or ransomware attack. Maybe ransomware is the only one that actually has real teeth for a CISO to go back to the board and saying, we should do and spend this amount of money because this. Because if you look at the Verizon data breach, for example, the CISO said, well, it's going to cost me how much money to run an upside program for this versus a fine. And if it doesn't have enough teeth, then I'd rather pay the fine because it's cheaper than running a security. Now, I'm not quoting or paraphrasing anyone, but it's the state of where breaches are. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I really like the way you frame that because, we know in cybersecurity, how long have we heard, the risk-based decision making or risk, based determinations, those kind of things in terms of the impact versus, the cost and those kind of things, the cost of protecting an asset versus the cost of implementing the security control or measure. And what businesses are doing is they're making that risk-based decision. They're saying, hey, if I don't, it's going to cost me X to do a mature, robust, effective AppSec program, for example. And versus the alternative, which is a fine, for example, of not doing it. And if the fine is not sufficient, they're going to choose the risk, they're going to choose appropriately. And it's interesting too, there's this kind of almost like a philosophical discussion because we've seen the regulation is starting to come into play because the consumers, the market itself is not really sufficient. I hate to pick on anyone, but I actually saw a post today about companies reaching $100 billion market cap in cybersecurity. It was Palo Alto, CrowdStrike, and Fortinet. And Fortinet was third on the list with like 70 billion market cap. And they've had how many highly visible, impactful, notable cybersecurity incidents and exploits in the last, say, 24 months or 12 months even. The market hasn't really reacted to that. So if the market, the consumers are not kind of driving sufficient response and behavioral changes in organizations, that's what many make the argument that cybersecurity is a market failure. Then you have regulation or the government, trying to step in and address those risks that are, impacting consumers and citizens and nations because the market forces aren't sufficient. So it's an interesting thing, but at the same time, again, you can go too far. And you could, impede innovation or even access for, certain services or products. Like in the EU market, I've seen some say certain companies won't offer certain products in that market, for example, because of the regulatory requirements to do so. So it's really like who wins in that scenario or what's the right answer. And it depends. It depends who you ask and, what their perspective is. So there's no perfect answer. Like anything else in security, it's a very complicated topic. It's a challenging topic.
It depends.
For sure. Mm-hmm.
It depends. The favorite answer to any security professional.
Yep.
I see though, like there is, I think, a threshold, like what we've seen with solar wind and few others, where fundamentally a problem affecting government or affecting critical national infrastructure, then causing a ripple effect or causing the whole industry or the government to step up and say, we're not going to accept this anymore. And I think we reached the point where I think it was Ivanti that the whole government ripped them off because of the VPN issue and the repeatable VPN issue. So there is a top line revenue damage, even though share price is not affected, but the whole revenue is affected. Now, conglomerates and mega company that maybe have one or two product that fails, the industry is not going to react. So that's where I like regulation to step in and say, this is the minimum bar that you need to comply to be able to sell to the government, to sell to everybody else. And those are big contracts. So those things have actually teeth to inject security. Probably if you look at Fortinet and few other of these products, they might have very legacy products that don't even have teams. And I'm coming from finance background, so I've seen a lot of legacy beast and COBOL development with API built on top of it. So sometimes you see monster without a dev team behind. So it's really hard for a business to say, hey, I'm going to just pour $1 million worth of dollars of bucks because I need to revisit the whole application. I need to rebuild security control of something that's been built 20 years ago. So it needs to have a counterpart for the CISO to leverage on and help the organization make the right risk-based decision. I would say the right risk-based decision.
Yeah, what's interesting, a couple of things as you're saying that I'm thinking about here is, as you notice, and this is we're in cybersecurity, right? And who are we talking about? We're talking about Avanti and Fortinet. We're talking about cybersecurity products and companies who are posing these risks. And not to say that others aren't, many others are as well, obviously. But it's almost like a black eye on the industry that your security tools, your security vendors are introducing pretty systemic, significant risks to the ecosystem. And it's, I think people are starting to slowly realize with problems like tool sprawl, for example, that your security tools are actually part of your attack surface. And they could be even more damaging and damning in some cases because they often have elevated permissions or broad visibility across the enterprise, sensitive data like vulnerabilities and weaknesses and things of that nature, sensitive data, those kind of things. So it is interesting, right, that the security tool itself, the vendors, not to pick on the two that we talked about, applies to any security vendor or product. They can be part of your attack surface too. So I think that we need to hold ourselves to a little bit of a higher standard in this industry. And it's interesting that, we kind of find ourselves talking about security products causing security problems.
Yeah, there is a counterpart to that I would like to bring up. As a security industry, we tend to be extremely jumpy, or we tend to have superstar bug bounty finder that tend to focus a lot maybe on security product because it has such a ripple effect. Having a security product that has a security flow, it's much more powerful than saying you have a normal CRM that have a security flow. It doesn't make the news so much. So maybe we hear more, and as human, we bias to focus more on some of these products. On some other end, every security product is a software product nowadays.
Yeah. I mean, it's so that's a good point you point out too, is like, and I've been guilty of this. Like, if you look at CISA's known exploited vulnerability list, people are like, well, Microsoft is on top of that list, right? But they
Of
got
course
tens
it
of
is.
billions in security revenue. But it's like, yes, because they're one of the most dominant, pervasive software companies in the world. So they're a very compelling target to attackers. The same goes for like, highly impactful security tools and products that you have in your enterprise. Those are enticing targets for attackers. So they get more attention. Right, it's like heavy as the crown that it comes with leading the industry or having industry-leading products. So it's I think we need to have a bit of humility and grace, for some of the companies that dominate the ecosystem in some regard, because they are such big targets and they are so pervasive. On one hand, we need to hold them to a higher standard, but on the other, we need to realize that they are also being targeted quite more than some others, for example, who aren't as pervasive or successful quite yet.
I do agree. And on that point, I wanted to point out maybe there is a whole trend on some of the industry to actually create this conglomerate of glue of products. So on the opposite of tool sprawl, you have consolidation with one vendor that maybe has half baked in security, functional security tools. So it's very good at one thing. And I'm not going to name names. but to try to get market shares across multiple elements, it's going to just buy and purchase different part of companies. And I've been in M&E and I've seen that some tool never get integrated, some tool never get the security that they require or they get built. So on the opposite, Tools Pro might make us more less secure. I would say Tools Pro will make us more secure if you choose the right tool.
Yeah, it goes back to it depends, right? Like there's some, every platform started off as a point product first, right? They built around a core competency, an initial kind of offering of some capability of some sort. They grew and expanded that capability to become more robust and comprehensive and offer other capabilities and functions and so on to capture more market share and just provide more value to their customers. And they grow and grow in terms of these platforms. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they do everything well, or that the things that they maybe acquire or acqui-hire or start to try to kind of bolt on to their product or platform have been done well. So that's a good point too, is like, it's like, I don't like the argument of like best of breed versus platforms. It's almost a false dichotomy. It's not either or. It's, you're going to have some mix of the two. Even the best platforms, for example, don't do all the things like, look at CNAPS and whatever acronyms we want to throw out there, but they still leave plenty of other areas of security that they don't do because it's just such a comprehensive, complex space. No one vendor does it all. So you're going to have a mix of the two, and it'll never be perfect.
Yeah, and especially on the security field is such a huge. Even software in itself is not a single point of things. Is right now you have ASPM, CNAP, CSPM, CTEM, call it whatever you want. Ghana is making a salad of names, but even in that industry, it's changing so quickly that you have new company and old company need to adapt. And in that, as you said, if there isn't regulation, then you have company going a little bit recklessly on both sides of the spectrum, the one that are focused on security and the one that are not focused on security. Because on the opposite side, you might have AI Regulatory Act that I think is focusing on the wrong aspect of regulation, is focusing on the data protection, because AU is very focused on data protection, but it's missing the fact that this tool, especially with the new Chinese AI being rolled out, are software tool, and not just data, but where they're getting installed might drive more security concern and risk of which data is being used in those tools. What do you think about? I need to mention Air1.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. Is it all comes back to, like you kind of closed there, it all comes back to the data, what kind of data types are involved, who's accessing it under what circumstances, how is it used? That's ultimately what's driving a lot of the regulatory requirements, is they're going after the data and how it's used and who it belongs to and how it's safeguarded. Those things are where ultimately what it all comes back to at the end of the day.
But going back full circle on the data, me and you have sparred on the MVD, CWE, on other kind of industry main challenge that we have. I'm going to bring up, just for the sake of smile and giggle, the current status of the Vulnerable program. I think right now we were promised how much? We were promised that we would reach for January this year, 0 vulnerability and all enriched vulnerability. We are actually, I think, past 20,000 and more. You wrote as well about this. MVD is failing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, actually, I had to go full screen. I had to go full screen and capture that. So, this is an interesting one, because I think a lot of people look to NVD and they think of it as some government entity, right, in the United States, and it's going to be foolproof and it's going to run and it's always going to be operational and functional. First off, like, you're dealing with the government, and who's been around the government or worked with the government, that's not how it works. It's an organization like any other, often with its own challenges and setbacks. In this case, what happened was the NVD, much like the U.S. federal government more broadly, contracts a large amount of the work out. And they had a lapse of what it seemed to be. First, they had some technical issues, right, of the volume of CVEs coming in and needing to be enriched due to better vulnerability research, more software, more CNAs, you name it, right? It's a lot of things that are contributing to that. And then obviously like a legacy kind of program and the architecture that helped sustain it. But then they had some contractual lapses, it seemed. where the vendor that was supporting, I think there was a lapse in the contract. They had to award a new contract to a new vendor. They made some public promises with regard to burning down the backlog of CVEs, but as you see, that hasn't happened. Whether there'll be any kind of consequence or impact to the vendor and or the MVD as part of that, I'm not sure. That backlog continues to grow rapidly, and it's a challenging thing because on one hand, people are like, well, hey, it's not reliable, it's not the data's not great. They'll start to seek out alternatives like OSV and GitHub security advisories and all these other alternatives out there. But that actually creates its own challenge now, because instead of kind of one vulnerability database, you have many disparate, multiple vulnerability databases that might have duplicative data, contradictory data. You need to kind of monitor and maintain feeds from all of them and kind of rationalize it across your portfolio of applications and software and systems. So it creates its own problem. I wish there was one authoritative source that was, highly functional, efficient, comprehensive in terms of the data quality and integrity, things of that nature. But that's not the reality we have right now because it's a complicated space. I hope they address the issue with the MVD because so many people do rely on it, and it was such a big problem, when it outright stopped working. But that backlog is growing. So what that means is everyone who's downstream, using widely used vulnerability scanning tools that rely on the MVD, for example, they may be blind to different vulnerabilities in their environment, assuming they even have an accurate, system or software or asset inventory, those type of things. If they're scanning all of that and it's missing enriched CVEs for vulnerabilities that they may have, they may be blind to those risks. So not only are they dealing with, we saw, I think it was 40,000 plus CVEs in 2024. So the exponential growth. Shout out to Gary Gamblin, a vulnerability researcher who always puts great information out on this, but double-digit exponential vulnerability growth, right? In 2024, like the years prior, same thing. It's growing faster than people can keep up. So the vulnerability backlogs keep growing. They may be blind to some of the information, let alone even be able to keep up. And it's a challenge. That's why I think a lot of people now are scrambling to say, hey, I don't need more notifications, alerts, things like that. I need clarity. I need clarity around prioritization. What matters? What do I need to address? What matters most? Because they kind of have this massive, pile of vulnerabilities and they really don't know where to start with it. And they're starting to see some of the legacy ways of doing it, CVSS based scores, things like that are not sufficient. In terms of addressing real risks. So it's a mess. It's a problem.
I think one question that I want to ask you is, and I've been puzzled about this myself, are we seeing more vulnerability because we're getting more diligent about reporting vulnerability? Are we seeing more vulnerability because there is more regulation around it, or in general there is more software, or all of the above?
Yes, exactly. I think in cybersecurity and in life, like we all love to argue everything in binary, like black and white. It's either this or it's that. And it's like, no, it's all the things. We have more CNAs, we have better vulnerability researchers, we have people who are using, Gen AI and LLMs to start to kind of identify vulnerabilities at a scale that maybe we couldn't do previously. People are starting to care more about vulnerabilities and ask more questions and want more transparency in reporting, for example. Vulnerability disclosure programs are getting more mature, bug bounty programs, things like that. And of course, we have more software. It runs everything from our consumer goods to our critical infrastructure to our national security and weapons systems, everything around our home. It's just so pervasive that, of course, more software equals more lines of code, which equal, just historically more vulnerabilities. And then if you look at the kind of quote unquote productivity boost that we see now from Gen AI, where it's democratizing everyone's ability to kind of go out and create applications and create software and create, things that they couldn't create previously. Or if you're a proficient software developer, be more productive and output more code velocity. It likely infers that we're going to see again an uptick or growth in vulnerable code or vulnerable products and systems and software, and we are struggling to keep up with that, and that's a real problem. But then it takes us back to the beginning of the conversation, which is, if there's no onus or requirement on the software vendors, this is something that was emphasized in the U.S. National Cyber Strategy, which again, we'll see how that plays out if we have a new one, if it changes course. They were pushing for the onus or the responsibility for this to be on the software vendor, the people producing the products, right? Rather than this problem of all of us downstream who are consuming the products needing to patch faster or implement compensating or mitigating controls, things like that. Whether that changes or not, I think that's going to drive whether we see a major systemic change in the number of vulnerabilities entering the ecosystem, or if it just keeps going up exponentially and we keep struggling to keep up with it.
No, I do agree with you that the Software Regulation Act, first of all, caused a whole ripple effect on the open source community, because open source maintainer were almost held accountable for, hey, I'm writing my free time software. All of a sudden, if you take curl and all of the very popular open source framework, including Linux, all of a sudden those people that contribute are made liable. Or if you take the biggest showcase Log4j, where it was like 3 or 4 developers developing that in the free time, and all of a sudden became the most hit news in Christmas 2023, was it? The
Yes.
star vulnerability.
Yeah, the open source piece is a whole nother kind of dynamic to this that is challenging because, as you said, it's largely these unpaid volunteers who are doing this in their free time. They're putting it out there for people to freely use and take and distribute as they see fit. But the idea that they should somehow now be responsible for it, and this is something that some of the very vocal open source maintainers and contributors have had to start to speak out on, is like, hey, this is put out there as is with no assurances, we don't owe you anything, right? You can take it, you can use it, but you're responsible for it. And I think that some of that common sense, policy has made it into things like from CISA and others that have been putting it out there saying, hey, like if you use open source, first you need to understand what you're using, right? Where it exists in your application or your software, your product. In some cases, maybe you need to be transparent about that with your consumers of, SBOM, right, is a hot topic, but like just being transparent about what's in the product. And whether you show that to the consumer or not, ultimately, whether it's, you need to be responsible for the product and everything you put in it, whether it's first party code, third party code, these libraries, these components are so pervasive and are in every, modern application and code base. You chose to use it. You need to be responsible for it. And I think that's shook the industry because a lot of, for years, it was like everyone got very comfortable just kind of taking and freely using things on the internet. And it's kind of bizarre, right? Because we hear like, while that was happening, right, we had to push for zero trust and no implicit trust and trust but verify, right? But when it came to open source, everyone was just taking it and using it. They have no clue who really made it, how well it's maintained, who contribute to it, how fast they remediate vulnerabilities. You have no assurances around remediation timelines, things like that. And then at the same time, no one really wants to financially contribute to it or actually contribute back in terms of, participating in the project and contributing fixes and things like that. So everyone wants to take advantage of it, but no one wants to give back to it. And they're exhausting, kind of this public good that we have out there for people to use. And it's a problem. It's definitely a problem.
Yeah, but and I want to take a shot at that because even in the case where some of us vendor take responsibility for Open Grep and similar open source projects, we tend to find some researcher that they want to take a shot at it just for the sake of glory. So there seems to be these superstar bug bounty researcher things that try to find the latest things and not even in the latest release version and try to make headline news. So as an industry, we're making hard for ourselves to actually maintain good security product. And then the open source is even bigger. But I'm not going to mention Open Grep anymore.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just going to say, we definitely sensationalize that. If someone can go find a vulnerability or a bug in some highly used, widely pervasive project or something like that, they can make a name for themselves. And it's human nature, right? They want to make a name for themselves. They want to open opportunities for themselves to make money, make a career move, whatever the case is. And we sensationalize that with the media and cybersecurity. So it's expected and anticipated that we see this happening.
Brilliant. I hope we can collaborate a little bit more on open source projects, security and non-security wise. I've seen definitely good example of good security practice of research that flag it up and then make it sensationalize, and some other less good practice. But I want to circle back maybe on the regulation aspect. You work with a lot of government and para-government organizations, so you have a very privileged view on the whole vulnerability management and the security posture, and we work a lot with commercial vulnerability management. What are the trends that you see in government organization like that kind of you see now? And I know it's a bit of a gamble, but you're going to see in the upcoming years with the new regulation. What's your take on it?
Yeah, so I think that, while we have, just like, for example, the administrative change and like the rescinding of executive orders, neither of the cyber executive orders were necessarily listed in the rescinded executive orders. And in the federal space, we talk about regulation and like, in the EU, for example, they're trying to regulate and enforce requirements on the commercial industry. Where in the US, like we said, it's a little bit more lax, it's a little bit more voluntary, best practices, self-attestation, those type of things. But when it comes to the public sector, federal government agencies, Department of Defense, things like that, the government spends tens of billions of dollars, even hundreds of billions of dollars a year in IT procurement, software procurement, things like that. And they are looking to use their significant purchasing power to drive systemic changes. So they may not be requiring, something between commercial entities to, commercial business to business, right? They may not be trying to dictate that. But if you're a software provider selling software to the federal government, they are able to dictate things to you in terms of being transparent, or, for example, having to have certain vulnerability remediation requirements and SLAs, or perhaps needing to self-attest, like the CISA secure software self-attestation requirement, self-attest that you're doing things like secure software development framework from NIST. And so I think that we are seeing the government look to use its purchasing power to push those requirements onto the commercial sector. And you got to think those commercial companies that do business with the government, they're some of the largest, most successful software companies in the world, who also, of course, do a lot of commercial business. So if the federal government can kind of drive, changes through its purchasing power in that way, it can lift the entire ecosystem, because those companies, of course, do a lot of commercial business too, B2B type business. So I think it's a little unique in that regards. They're looking to use that within the federal context, that, and have that kind of spill over into the commercial industry.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to bring up maybe the very famous and infamous 2201 and 02 that were the original kind of source. And until I did this, I didn't realize there were other executive orders that made the same ripple effect and strengthened the requirement. The first order on SBOM and in general on fixing vulnerability in a precise timeline, as you say, Chris, drove a security posture on the whole government, and then overall as a ripple effect on anybody that was selling to the government. And I think that was strong, because there was a regulatory requirement that drove a better posture on the whole industry. And I really like that from the US side. I didn't see that in Europe with the more lax kind of aspect from NCSE and NIS. So despite having more regulation here, I think this regulation had more teeth and more consequence and more impact than what we saw in Europe with the highly regulated environment. That's my take.
So I guess I'll play devil's advocate, surprisingly, in this sense. Is like, I do think secure by design is great, and I do think that some of the things we've seen around CISA secure self-attestation and the SPD directives and the binding operational directives you just show are great. But there are some challenges with that. For example, the secure by design pledge is voluntary, right? So people, first off, no one has to do it, right? They can volunteer to do it. We saw many of the organizations that did volunteer to do it were security companies who are incentivized to kind of drive the secure by design narrative, of course. And not to pick on it, but and then again, there's no third-party attestation or kind of validation. It's just, we're just, you say you're doing these things, we've taken your word you're doing these things, you're voluntary pledging that, publicly. Of course, there could be like some, blowback in reputation and trust and things like that if it came out that you didn't do some of the things you said you were doing. But it's not perfect, right? There's no third party validating that you're doing these things per se, and no one's going to make you do them. You're volunteering to do this. So I think it's a step in the right direction, and maybe it is the right direction unless we want to kind of go in a much more heavy-handed, cumbersome, a regulatory driven type manner, where we go force people to do things and then we validate that they're doing them and things like that. But I actually come from, I served in a couple federal roles. One of them after the military, one of them was with FedRAMP. And FedRAMP, right? Many people are familiar with that. It's what it dictates what cloud service providers can do business with the federal government and be consumed by the federal government in terms of cloud service offerings. But it does have a mandatory requirement and a third party that comes and validates you're doing the things you say you're doing. In a market of tens of thousands of SaaS and cloud providers, there's like 350 approved providers on the FedRAMP marketplace, and that's after over a decade. So on one hand, maybe we have some assurances around these 350 vendors, but at the same time, we've kind of severely constrained the government's ability to lean into those commercial SaaS offerings, because you can only pick from these 350 of the tens of thousands because of this very heavy-handed, process-oriented third-party attestation type model that you have that's very costly for small businesses. So it's a difficult dichotomy, and we got to pick, kind of pick our poison, because each path has pros and cons.
Yeah, no, it's FedRAMP has definitely teeth and is a double-edged sword, because you might limit yourself to the big names that can actually afford FedRAMP, because it's very expensive, not just from an audit perspective, but also from an investment perspective. And if you're a startup, you're never gonna get FedRAMP before Series C.
Yeah. Go tell the investor, hey, we want to do this thing. It's going to take 2 years, and it's going to cost, potentially millions of dollars, or hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, whatever the case is. And there's no assurances that we'll automatically get business at the end of this, but we may be able to. That's a very hard sell for some of these early like you said, early series type companies. So the federal market usually is not a target until companies get a bit more mature. And as you point out, that right, maybe that's good. They're mature. They have some robust security programs, things like that in place. But at the same time, maybe you don't get access to those innovative, smaller, earlier companies, because they simply can't afford to make that commitment quite yet.
Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum. Maybe we should propose FedRAMP Lite for startup companies at a specific level. Also, because if you look at it from FedRAMP perspective, it was put in place for those legacy systems that maybe have legacy stuff behind them, so they need a higher regulatory and a higher push to fix stuff. While as a startup, you might cut corner, but as well, you have a much more modern stack. You are more lean, and you can execute much faster. So to patch something, for example, we patch in today, while some of the organizations that I had the pleasure to work with was 200 plus day.
Yeah, not to again introduce, like, it depends, but okay. So for example, you're a mature, like you said, maybe you're younger, you're newer, you're nimble. You can be cloud native. You can do automation. Those kind of things, right? So maybe you're more secure in that regard, or can be more secure. But on the contrary, maybe you're more mature. You're a more established company. You have a bigger security team. You have more security tools. You have more established policies and processes to kind of do security. Where if you're a startup, you're focused on speed to market, capturing market share, getting go-to-market motions in place, getting your sales team going. You might not even have a security team, right? Maybe you have a security person who's doing all the things, and they obviously don't want to slow down velocity of getting the new features out there, getting market share, appeasing the early adopters of the product. So again, it depends. Like, there's no both of those paths have pros and cons, and have things to consider in terms of being secure or not. Neither is automatically kind of inherently more secure or less secure than one or the other.
Yes, but also you have an end company. If you find a major security vulnerability on a security startup, it's an end game for that startup. So the weight of it actually has real consequence for a startup
Yeah,
or for a scale up.
if I could, so that's absolutely true. As we talked about, like the leaders of the market, right? The $100 billion market caps, tens of billions of market cap companies, they have many incidents and exploited vulnerabilities, and they go on just fine. Whereas you said, a smaller company maybe doesn't survive that, because they don't get another chance, right? They haven't kind of gotten market traction and kind of entrenched themselves in organizations. So they need to be very conscious of building that reputation and building that trust early, for sure.
Brilliant. Let's talk about AI. And AI augmented vulnerability management, but also AI augmented reporting of vulnerability. You mentioned it before. I think I've seen it from my end. There are some good work out there from few companies that are trying to use AI to report vulnerabilities. But I also saw in the core project a lot of garbage being generated and being automatically reported, including the MVD. And that's going back in circle to give a slack to the MVD that got an enormous amount of hit in terms of CNA and automatic reporting vulnerability. So AI for security good or AI for security bad for Chris Hughes?
Uh, I again, it depends, right? Like, maybe it scales our ability to identify vulnerabilities, and even kind of propose code fixes, and drive velocity of remediating vulnerabilities or bugs. But as you said, maybe it just means garbage in, garbage out. Maybe we find more low quality, low fidelity findings and report them much faster than we ever did. And it kind of just really it further compromises the data of the MVD, for example, that people are relying on, or the other vulnerability databases for that matter. So it really depends. And then, you said AI good for security, AI good or bad for security. There's kind of the angle of using AI for cybersecurity use cases like vulnerability discovery, GRC, AppSec, pen testing, all these kind of things that people are exploring with. But then conversely, there is the need to secure AI, right? As we see it get integrated in every product, every organization, every enterprise. Is it being done securely? We don't know quite yet. It's safe to say if historical trends that are came before this, like DevOps and cloud and things like that, are any indicator, maybe not, because people are just quick to use it. They don't really understand it quite yet that well. Like we all saw the lift and shift period of cloud, and they're like, wait, if you move one dumpster fire from here to the cloud, like it's still a dumpster fire, it's just in the cloud. The same thing with AI. If you rapidly adopt this and don't put measures in place around least permissive access and need to know, and data disclosure, data loss, etc., those can be real problems now as well. So I think it still remains to be seen in terms of whether it's going to be a bigger pro or con. One thing I will say, though, is with those early technological waves like DevOps and cloud and things like that, agile software development, et cetera. Security has historically been very risk averse, right? We kind of stay back and watch and analyze and and speculate about what could go wrong, what may go wrong, things like that. But I find that also keeps us from building proficiencies or competencies in these new technologies. With AI, I'm seeing a little bit of more leaning in by the security community of going out there, tinkering with it, experimenting with it, trying to understand how does it, like, because how could you possibly secure something if you don't even understand how it works?
Okay.
So going out there, playing with it a little bit, seeing what can be done, how can we use this to make our lives better, not just kind of playing defense only in terms of how attackers use it. So I am optimistic in that regard. I hope we can find some really great ways to use it to address some of these systemic security challenges that we've been talking about.
No, I do totally agree with you. I think I've seen two factions of people terrified by AI from a security folks perspective, and people just absolutely embracing and loving it. We've been experimenting, tinkering for one of the common problem, that is the root cause analysis, or CWE. And I'm particularly very excited about using AI to solve very systemic problem that has been taxing us for ages. But maybe back on that subject, the security by design, a lot of the CISO regulation have been pushing us to fix root cause of particular vulnerability. Now, me and you, we've been tinkering with vulnerability for most of our life. We know what a CWE, a CV is, but for the new folks that comes into this industry, why is it so difficult to get to the root cause of a specific problem? Why do we have these systems that are hyper complex?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors there, but some that come to mind is like we get into this habit when we get into an organization or just get into the career field of like, you run a tool, you run a scan, it produces findings, and these have CVE IDs, for example, and you just get in the habit of kind of fixing things and mitigating things, looking at the number of vulnerabilities and those kind of trends, and never stepping back and looking at like root causes or CWE IDs, like you talked about, kind of these recurring weaknesses that are occurring over and over. We're just kind of in this pack hamster wheel of like address the issue but never step back and understand the kind of root cause of it. So I think people start to as they get into their career a little bit longer, they get a little bit more mature. Maybe they say, hey, I've seen this problem like many times now, like what is causing it, like what's the root cause here, like how do we actually address this rather than just kind of be on this hamster wheel. But I will say, some of that has to do with the differences in terms of whether you're a consumer, right? Everyone's like a consumer and a producer in some sense of software. But, I say this in the context of if I'm producing a product, it's kind of on me, right, to take that onus to fix these systemic kind of root causes rather than just pushing down, vulnerability disclosures and notifications to my consumer and telling them, hey, you need to patch, hey, you need to patch. And like you might be patching the same kind of CWE or weakness over and over again rather than the vendor, right, the people producing the product or that you're consuming, fixing it themselves. So it really depends in terms of your who you are and that kind of consumer versus producer paradigm. But I think it behooves all of us to kind of understand CWE root causes. Look at and there's some great information out there in terms of like top 25 most exploited CWEs or most dangerous CWEs, and like obviously people will argue about the list and the rankings of the list and things like that. But you can go out there and get familiar with it and just understand what are some of the common weaknesses, what are we seeing over and over again, and what are people exploiting in the wild, and I think that information is great. So definitely recommend people going to check it out.
I have a beef with CW Top 25. You know that we pushed out, me, Patrick, we pushed out a couple of opposite views, I think, on the top ranking. And again, we have OWASP top 10, we had CWE, we had top CV or CWE exploited in CISAKEV. It really depends by what you're looking at, but we see some common trend and pattern. And that's why I absolutely love the root cause analysis, because behind a lot of these, there have been some of the root cause that I've seen over and over and over, like remote code execution being used in 0 days, or buffer overflow. Those are common root cause that I see over and over and over. So I like this root cause overview because maybe helps us looking at things from a different perspective instead of prioritizing from just exploitable that, and what we see more exploited in the wild that is absolutely critical. Maybe we can address the root cause of specific problem or the one that's going to cause us the next ransomware attack or 0 day. Like there are definitely a common pattern between CWE, CISAKEV, and common exploited methods. This is the CISAKEV kind of analysis from last year from the top 12 and top 30. I still see the same one exploited over and over and over. The challenge is we don't do a good job about creating CWE that will drive to the root cause. And that is me answering my own question. Why don't we use more CWE?
No, it's a good question. Honestly, it's a good question to ask. And I will say, I know, Jenny Easterly and CISA and folks there, during her tenure did quite a bit of evangelism of pushing for vendors to make more use of CWE and actually provide that information for the CVEs that are being published. Same for CNAs that are kind of putting that information out there. Because without it being put out there, like you're talking about, kind of breaking it down here and understanding the data, it's going to be hard to do that kind of root cause analysis and get to the bottom of it. But it's getting people to kind of drive in that direction and do that additional level of work and provide that additional level of clarification and detail. Again, if it kind of comes back to the regulatory conversation, like what's going to force them to do that, if anything? And if not, will they do that additional work out of their own goodwill and just voluntarily? I don't know. I think some organizations will, some won't. And it's going to be that way until, kind of there's a forcing function that drives everyone to make use of this kind of data.
Yeah, but maybe we can automate some of this stuff with using LLM and using AI. I think that we start seeing some good result from some of that level of automation, but also from that level of automation, also some level of simplification, because as I dig into CWE, I find it extremely mentally taxing. While we could maybe do a little bit of a simplification to the top 10, again, root cause analysis that we see across for weaknesses. Because I don't have a PhD in cybersecurity, but looking at CWE, I find it extremely complex and extremely convoluted, whilst extremely detailed, but for different reasons. And going full circle on, hey, I'm a developer, I need to secure my software. What do I prioritize? Having a full PhD that explain me this particular set of CWE are more important than this other one, I find it not serving as a security professional, but actually is a drawback on us. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I think, if someone like you, right, who's living and breathing this and being down in the data is saying that, hey, this is complex, this is confusing, it's challenging. Imagine folks who are just kind of, doing day-to-day activities, whether on security or development or engineering or whatever the case is, and they encounter vulnerabilities that they need to navigate and work with. I think that it's concerning, right? So I am glad to hear that, people like you and organizations like yours are out there kind of digging into this data, trying to make it more accessible, improve the quality of data, whether through visualizations or the way it's communicated, improve the fidelity of the information that's there. We need more of this. So we need more organizations doing this because it needs to be accessible for everyone. A lot of people aren't honestly just spending, most of their time digging down into this data. They just want to know, right, just tell me, what's the root cause here? Just tell me the information I need to know.
Yeah, no, I think we're doing a campaign on that, on simplification of CWE and kind of bringing the really the most simple one that you can see here across the board. And I want to maybe leave on this on a good note that there is a solution out there. There is maybe simplification, and I like the KISS method. Keep it simple. I'm gonna leave the last part of keep it simple out there, but maybe we need to simplify a lot how we categorize the root cause to help developer kind of addressing the more important factors, but also us to create a language that everybody can understand. I know that we are almost at the time. Chris, you've wrote two fantastic books on both software security and vulnerability management. What are your take from those two books, and what is your next one, maybe?
Next one, I'm not sure. I haven't been able to convince my wife to let me do another quite yet. She's like, hey, you need to slow down for a little bit. We got 5 kids, so they keep me pretty busy. And honestly, I don't want to write just to write. Like, so I'm, keeping an eye on the industry. I have been contributing to a couple books recently as a contributing author around AI and stuff. So I'm excited about that. But my takeaways from those two books is like, I try to shed a lot of light on issues that we had around software supply chain security, both from proprietary vendors, first party code, things like that, open source, things that we talked about, the regulatory landscape, and of course, vulnerability management, some of the nuances we talked about here with MVD and CVE, CWE, et cetera. And there are a lot of problems, but the truth is at the same time, if you look at where we are now versus say where we were 10 years ago with these type of things around vulnerability disclosure, the amount of transparency around vulnerabilities, how quickly they may get remediated, just the overall ecosystem itself in terms of regulation and compliance, things are in a far better place than they were say 5 to 10 years ago. So we are moving in the right direction, and which is good because software is it's not going anywhere. It's going to continue to run like everything I said, like consumer goods, critical infrastructure, national security use cases. So there's a lot of problems out there, but luckily we have an incredible, passionate, enthusiastic cybersecurity community who rally around these problems and are working on these problems. So I'm humbled and thankful to be a part of the community and all the amazing people out there that do all the things that we do in this career field. So yeah, I'm excited.
Chris, and we have some fan base here that shout about the software transparency book and solving vulnerability management at scale. They're available on Amazon. So if you haven't touched on those, please grab yourself a couple of copies because they're a fantastic book. And I particularly like the fact that you give an overview that is data driven rather than just the academic. It's a very practical use of vulnerability management rather than the academic view. You shall do this as a very practical approach. So for folks that haven't touched those, please do have a look at those two fantastic books. I know that we're almost at the time. There are tons of questions, but maybe we need to do a follow-up maybe in 3 months to see how the regulation is in the US and Europe, if it has grown teeth. Otherwise, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a fantastic conversation. We have left out a lot of other topics and questions and answer, but maybe a follow-up on this. Any last
Sounds good to
thoughts?
me.
Any last
No,
thoughts on this?
sounds good to me. I'm always game to come hang out and chat. I've been looking at the comments, and I'm really appreciative of folks, kind of jumping in and dropping some of the comments and questions in here. And yeah, just excited to be part of the community, like I said. So feel free for anyone that wants to chat, hit me up on LinkedIn or check out. I run a blog on Substack called Resilient Cyber, so you can check that out. Where I put a lot of resources and thoughts on these topics out there too. And yeah, look forward to chatting with anyone anytime.
And a fantastic email list. Brilliant.
Appreciate that.
Thank you very much, folks. See ya, Chris.
Take care.